For the session today, just a little bit about what our hopes are is I think a lot of the time when we are doing panels, we tend to move from a space of hierarchies. There are very rigid ways of how we engage with panels, but we really want to invite people into a conversation in the same way that we are um, kind of the theme of the session, but also the way that we are holding the session, really remembering that this is a conversation in which different knowledges and processes to knowledge are interacting with each other and building in itself a knowledge set here. So just inviting everyone to participate actively and just to participate also freely and engage in a way where we're kind of all in this together. This is something that belongs to all of us. And we're all a part of this conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to engage that way. So I'm going to stop rambling and pass it on to the amazing folks that will be leading us through this conversation. And just thank you all for being here, for being present, for being a part of this process. And as I pass it on, thank you to everybody who is participating in this panel and all of the amazing experiences, stories, identities, ways of thinking and being and doing and pushing that you're bringing to this space and to all of us. So a lot of gratitude, and passing it off to Megan.
Thank you, Leila. And again, yeah, thank you to everyone. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a moment to ask out loud if Micah, you've been able to join us, maybe under another name. Micah is one of the amazing speaker, and we're kind of having trouble to get her in the space. So just wanted to do a quick check-in. I don't think so. So we'll see if she can join us or not. But yeah, now that we've set the table, it is my pleasure to introduce you to the 4 or 5 amazing speakers who have kindly accepted the invitation to be with us today and share their experience, approaches, and perspective. And to start, I would like to introduce you to Berta Mukanda. So Berta is Vidia's Inclusions Manager. Based in Lusaka, Berta is a passionate learner, always pursuing new opportunities to engage in global issues and a champion of Indigenous and Zambian youth. She recently completed her Master in Special Education at the University of Zambia. After we have Celia Romulus, assistant professor at the University of Ottawa's Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies and the School of International Development. Her work focuses on anti-oppression, anti-racist education, Afro and decolonial feminism, and topics like gender, race, migration, and political violence. Formerly a program director for UN Women, she now consults on anti-oppression and Black feminities, masculinities. And Celia received the 2023 CAGS ProQuest Distinguished Dissertation Award in the Art, Humanities, and Social Sciences. After we have the pleasure to have with us today Farada Jacob Lightning, who works with Vidia as a project advisor for the Beyond the River project, which is part of Vidia's climate team. He recently interned in Zambia, and the experiences there have reshaped how he views international development. Moreover, he's a community leader in the indigenous communities of Maswakis and Nintin. Which gives him a unique perspective in the space he works in. So the future is bright and full of wonderful changes, and Farada cannot wait to share some of them with you. And we are happy that you'll do so. Thank you. We also have the pleasure of having with us Maïka Sandarji, who is an associate professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. She obtained her PhD from the University of Toronto and a SSHRC Banting postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Montreal. Her first book, Perdre le Sud, décoloniser la solidarité internationale, addresses systemic sexism, colonialism, and inequalities in North-South relations. She then edited a collective volume on feminist approach of international relations in 2022 and co-edited one titled White Saviorism in International Development, Theories, Practices, and Lived Experience, which leads me to introduce Temeris Khan, who also co-edited this book. She's an independent development professional and researcher with almost 30 years of practitioner and policy-based experience in international development, aid effectiveness, gender, and global migration. She has worked with a vast spectrum of multilateral and bilateral organizations, ENGOs, and civil society organizations, primarily based in Pakistan, but also in Canada and South Asia. She has a number of publication and article on aid, humanitarianism, and development to her credit. She blogs, speaks, and writes actively on notion of national autonomy, north-south power imbalance in development, race relations and immigrant citizenship and integration, and migrant and refugee rights. So that concludes the quick introduction I had to do to everyone, but please, when answering the first question, feel free to add anything to present yourself, talk a bit about your work. So to kick off the conversation, I think it's important that we set the table based on your perspectives and experience. So as we aim to redefine knowledge in international development, how would you characterize the current landscape from which we are starting? So in what ways do our current knowledge practices uphold existing norms and power dynamic within the sector? And to open up the floor, I would pass it on to Celia.
Hello again, everyone. It's always difficult to start. Okay. So I'll just go back to I guess the title of the panel, which is Beyond the Colonial Lens, because that's what caught my attention initially. And I took it as I guess as a reminder of what Tuck and Yang are telling it, that decolonization or decoloniality is not a metaphor. It's a political project, it's a verb. So that actions like speak louder than words. So, and to me, that also signals that knowledge production needs to change in radical ways. And I feel like the landscape hasn't changed much. I feel like most of the tools, philosophies, frameworks that were initially designed or dreamt for emancipation are being whitened or being depoliticized or being co-opted by institutions, be it by institutions who produce like public policy, but also educational ones. So I feel like actually our institutions are becoming more and more astute in doing that work rather quickly. Notably because they actually train our practitioners and scholars who actually have the privilege and the power to label what is decolonial and what isn't, right? So I think that at the end of the day, we are caught in cycles in which Western-centered universities and practitioners, no matter where they are located, actually decide what actually constitutes decolonial work or practices. So to me, moving beyond colonial lens and changing the current landscape would actually require us to ask a different sets of questions when it gets to the political economy of knowledge production. So moving away from labels and probably recentering on the impact that it has, right? That our knowledge has on different groups of people, and also how I would say our capacity to center voices that have been strategically marginalized, and our capacity to dream like radical futurities, I would say. So it's kind of focusing on what actually produces emancipation and moving away also away from distraction. And when I say distraction, I'm referring to how Toni Morrison defines it, that distraction is like the serious function of racism, that it keeps you from focusing on your work because you'll have to justify that you're a human being, you have to justify that you had a language, you have to justify that you have a history, so on and so forth. So for me, the landscape in itself hasn't changed that much. So we actually need to rethink the questions that we ask and how we produce knowledge overall still.
Thank you, Celia, for opening up the floor with that great perspective. And I'll just invite other speaker to jump in and to answer one after the other when it feels like the moment.
I guess I can go ahead. Thank you so much for allowing us to be here. And how I feel about where we are currently is that we're on the precipice of change. And how I know that is that we have a diverse panel here from incredible, amazing women who've worked really hard to be where they're at and to share their perspectives. And one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is in what ways do our current knowledges practices uphold existing norms and power dynamics within the sector? For me personally, it would have to be going into community and well, presuming that you have all the knowledge or that you're going to fix the community. When I went to Zambia, my grandfather told me specifically beforehand, when you go, your opinion doesn't matter. You're there to listen and learn. You're not there to teach the people because the communities have been there longer than we've been alive, and they know what they need. So even if we have like a framework or a cool program that we've devised over here in Canada or elsewhere, we need to go into those communities and keep in mind that maybe that's not what the community wants. They have an idea of what their community needs, and it might be more tied to food security. Because we have all these great ideas that we've created from afar, but that's in our little silos. But the people that live on the land know what they're doing. And I just quickly wanted to share that. Thank you.
I can jump in. Thank you very much for inviting all of us to be here on this panel today to the Earth Hub. I think in this sort of a scenario, one of the main questions to ask, and I speak purely from a practitioner's perspective as well, having worked in the sector as a practitioner for many, many years, is that how do you define knowledge in international development? I think that's the first thing. We have been accustomed to knowledge being as an educational resource. It's more of an academic endeavor as opposed to something that we do every day and every minute of our lives. And in international development, if we're talking about the fact that we are there on the ground working with people and working to improve lives, we also have to understand that we are looking at knowledge in a very different way. That knowledge is not systematic. That knowledge is not linear. That knowledge is not, it's continually evolving based on people's lives and experiences and the experiences of the environments that they live in. And I think that is the most important aspect that we need to acknowledge and understand, because the way the international development sector has been structured, as we all know, it is a top-down approach from the global north. And the idea that all the knowledge is centered there and it's being passed on to us in the global south is, I think, something that has also defined the way the sector works and operates. So I think that's the first instance that we need to know. We need to completely change our definition of knowledge. That knowledge does not necessarily come from books. Necessarily, I'm saying it does, but not necessarily. And particularly when you're talking about a sector like development, it comes from people. As Farada also said, right? So I think that is the first thing we need to do is redefine knowledge and then recenter the idea of where knowledge comes from and how we interpret a lot of that knowledge as well. Because again, the sector has perpetuated this myth that knowledge will only come from, quote unquote, lessons learned, or from evaluations, or from whatever field research the person coming into a community from the outside will do. That's not the type of knowledge we want to perpetuate. We want to perpetuate the idea that the knowledge has always been there, and it is subject to change, and it is subject to change under different contexts. And that's something we need to respect and recognize.
Thank you very much. I can go. Looking at the first question, how do we redefine knowledge in the international development, and how would you characterize the current landscape from which we are starting now? In the globalized and international world today, we need to create an inclusive environment that ensure that everyone is recognized in the community. What do I mean? Most of the time, in different countries in the world, we have very strong coherent development policies and programs on papers, but delivery or implementation has been so challenging, especially in developing countries. So if the implementation is put at first, we have people who are elite in the communities. These are people with disabilities, young people that are always left behind. Who knows, maybe the one who can change the world is someone that we are leaving behind with a disability, and we feel he can't fit in this sector, this can't do anything, and we're always pushing them down. I remember last time when I was in a placement of a certain school, there was this young lady, she was very creative. She made a very nice basket using the bottles, very decorative things. I was like, there's a skill here, there's a knowledge of wanting to change something in the world. And most of the time, these are the people that we push behind. Oh, she can't do anything, he can't do anything. But if we promote inclusivity, we are going to cultivate a lot of knowledge from the people that we feel they can't make it. Thank you. That's how I can go on the first question.
Thank you so much. It's a great way to open up the discussion. And so now that we have a bit more perspective on the landscape, you've characterized how have the colonial roots. Well, sorry, I'm gonna stop. I think I see Micah, with us. So hi, happy that you were able to join. I'm gonna now spotlight you. Sorry, it's a bit abrupt to enter and start, but I had a chance to introduce you a bit earlier, and I'll just give you the chance to maybe talk a bit more about your work, add anything to the bio you send if you'd like to. And after, if you'd like to answer the first question to give us your perspective on the landscape we're starting from, it would be interesting so that it will be a bit smoother for when we continue the conversation all together.
Great. I am so sorry. I have no excuse except that my baby woke up very, very early this morning. So all my schedule was out the window, and I'm so sorry. It's the first time it ever happens to me. I'm gonna remember that forever now that I'm late to a conference. I'm so sorry. So yes, I am a international development professor. I am mixed race. I come from a background of white settler colonial from my mother's side, and Indo-Malagasy from my father's side. So my point of view, of course, is tainted by this. And yeah, I've worked, my most important work in the past years has been an edited volume on white saviorism, the concept of white saviorism in international development with Tim Riscan and Dixon Kanakulia. We did an edited volume with 15 practitioners and people who have lived experiences of white saviorism from the global south. Everyone was from the global south. I myself was born in Canada, so that also taints my my perspective, of course. So yes, I'm doing a lot of discourse analysis on especially the narrative aspect of white saviorism. So how we reproduce a discourse based on racial hierarchies.
Thank you, and no worries. We're all human. It happens. We have different things in our life, and we're just really thankful that you took the time out of your really busy schedule of being a researcher and like a professor, but also a mother. So thank you so much. No worries. And if you don't mind, maybe I'll ask you again the first question, just so we have a chance to hear everyone on it. So as the other one already answered, there's only you, and then we'll continue. So like based on your perspective, your experience, when we aim to redefine knowledge in our sector, how would you characterize the current landscape from which we are starting? And so in what ways do our current knowledge practices uphold existing norms and power dynamic within the sector?
I'm just gonna look at the question again. So I'm not, yeah, so good. So I think we believe that the sector has evolved a lot, but it has not. I mean, from the work I'm doing in discourse analysis, I can see that we still are talking from a Western gaze perspective, and a lot of our organizations are also unconsciously, we can go into intentionality later, but consciously or unconsciously adopting a Western white gaze. so in my classes, so I'm teaching this class on non-Western theories of development, and one of my students is doing right now a thesis on knowledge in international development in universities, and so we can see that where we still teach from a place where we start international development with Western countries helping non-Western countries, which of course is biased, but also it's not just historically, it's also the theories we adopt, the who we give agency to, who we assign. So that's why with our book, I realized I was talking about Temarise as if she wasn't there, and you probably mentioned the book already. I'm so sorry, I was running so much. So yeah, so I think it starts from people working in the sector. It starts in university, but then it percolates up to when we work, who we value as epistemic agents. And I don't want to be too theoretical, but we don't value people the same way. There's of course, a racial hierarchy there. And so we need to value people at all stages of knowledge production. So who in universities, who we assign, but also how much weight we give to all people in our classes, but also when we have a project, we often believe now that we do localization and we're super inclusive, but we usually are inclusive in certain aspects of the work. So we're going to include in most of the projects we do, except for writing the call for proposal and evaluating the project. So that's where we need to deconstruct the Western gaze, and we need the most to deconstruct the way we think and the way we've been doing things. So I'll stop there, and so I can come back to other things later.
Thank you. Thank you for adapting to that really abrupt way to enter a panel. Really appreciate. So now that we've had a chance to hear everyone on their perspective to set up the table, I would like to ask, how have the colonial roots of the international development sector influenced whose knowledge is validated and valued? And so how do you see the effects today, especially when thinking about what's going on in Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan, Congo, Haiti, and other crises? And Celia, given your personal experience and knowledge of this situation in Haiti, I'd like to start by directing the question to you.
All right, like I initially thought that like I would be able to answer that question in French, but we pivot. So I think that like first and foremost, I'd like to kind of like remind us like to sit with the question first, which is the fact that like we're grouping a lot of context in that same question. And I know like we have to ask questions, so it's a fact. However, just to keep in mind that like we're actually referring to contexts that are entirely different and deal with very specific issues when it gets to imperialism, colonialism, and come back to the specificities of perhaps the ongoing war in Gaza and ongoing genocide. And that like a reminder that like when we're talking about genocide in settler colonial context, that we're also talking about this session, I guess, we're also talking about cultural genocide, we're talking about suicide. I think that's a fundamental thing. That being said, you know, I try to spend as much as possible in solidarity with my colleagues who do work on Gaza, who are Palestinian. But I don't know that context very well. I'm still educating myself through those like solidarity projects. So I'm a little bit more comfortable speaking about Haiti. So some of you might know or might not know, and the not knowing is also a signal of like what's in the media and how it is portrayed in the media or not, in terms of visibility or invisibility. But like might know that like for the last couple of years, Haiti has been going through a lot of emotions and challenges, I would say, with a lack of, I would say, systems of like governance and imposed like at interim government at the moment. and also like very worrying, like I would say rates of um, violence, gang violence, knowing that like gangs at the moment control the vast majority of the capital. So we have been dealing with a lot of structural violence and economic crisis, gang violence, so people being shot and kidnapped, which has paralyzed most of the capital and has consequences for the whole country, including massive migration to and all Ayala, so the Americas, including North America. So I guess in knowledge production, it also means that most of our infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, or that our institutions are closed or on and off, like functioning on and off, including universities and schools, right? So to answer your question and I also do not really use the word crisis because I guess the crisis has been one of the words that have been used like historically to define Haiti, but you can't be in crisis for 200 years or more than 200 years. And that's also a word that like basically helps to avoid acknowledging like all the structural issues and also international intervention that brought us to where we are today. But my point here is that everything that is happening in the capital makes it for impossible working conditions for educators, scholars, and so on and so forth. So my answer to your question is that like I feel like I haven't seen a lot happening when it gets to solidarity with scholars back there, or even when it gets to the diasporas of the context that you're referring to, I'm talking about here, which is extremely problematic, right? So I'm going back to my first response that like if we're talking about decolonial approaches, it can't just be performative or a discourse, right? So if your actions do not match the discourse, then I feel like we're kind of like not being where we should be, right? So for these scholars right now, some of them have been part of the massive waves of migration to other geographies, which medium long term will be really terrible for the country. A massive brain drain. Just as a reminder, with the Biden program for Haitians, it's been close to 200,000 people leaving the country in the past 2 years. That's a lot. And that includes like doctors, educators, nurses, so on and so forth, right? So for me, the colonial roots are actually visible in the fact that knowledge production or the ways in which knowledge has been produced hasn't changed a lot despite that context. So there hasn't been a lot of projects that aim to produce knowledge to actually support people directly over there, to rethink co-authorship, rethink co-supervisions, and like in thinking that like they don't have an income coming in at the moment. So that to me is like where you see the colonial roots, that you want to keep working in the same way with your colleagues who are in a context in which they're literally dying and cannot do their work. And then instead of actually rethinking your partnerships, you're like, oh, we're just going to do the research over Zoom, right? Because we can't travel to go back there. And you're going to ask your colleagues to actually go and interview when it's not safe for them either. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit fired up because it has been like very problematic. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And it's important to talk about the thing you feel, yeah, that are important sharing in those kind of situation and moment. And again, just want to reiterate the fact that at any point, if other speakers just want to bounce off or answer what others are sharing, feel free. You don't have to wait for me to pinpoint someone. And so, but I'm happy to do it too. Temerisa, I saw that you unmuted yourself, so I'll let you speak.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, just sort of wanted to jump in before I lost this. This just happened yesterday, so it sort of just popped into my head as a very pertinent example of the idea of the colonial roots of knowledge. So I was interviewed yesterday by BBC Radio 4 on a show that was commemorating 40 years of the Ethiopian famine, or rather 40 years of the UK's response to the Ethiopian famine in 1984. And it was a panel of entirely white UK journalists and intellectuals, I am told, and humanitarians. And I think I was the only non-white person on the panel. I mean, forget about that. There was not even an Ethiopian, let alone an African person on that panel. So that goes number one. Okay, so like that's knowledge, right, in a way. Secondly, as expected, not just from the BBC, but I think from most Western mainstream media outlets, there is this desire to trigger negativity about the rest of the world. And all the notions being perpetuated during that discussion, I've put it online on LinkedIn if anyone's interested in listening in, were all about literally starving Black African children. Like 40 years later, that image is still the image of charity, of aid, of humanitarianism, and the fact that the Western world went and saved starving Black African children. And if that happens again, we will do that. And my question was, it's happening in Palestine. How come you're not doing massive charity efforts to save dying children in Palestine? And of course, Micah, white saviorism did not go down well at all with that panel. But just to say that the whole idea was that no, we are still the owners and controllers of knowledge. What our perspective is the most important, because I kept talking about the fact, well, what about Africans? Do you not want to listen what they have to say? And that applies everywhere to the global south, not just Africa. And obviously the countering was, yes, but they're corrupt. Their governments were installed, and it was so this perpetuation in the mainstream media about the fact that we still know better is still very, very prevalent, and that does stem from the colonial lens, regardless of that might be 100 years old, but it's still very much there, that insecurity that no, we were the ones who brought in progress and development across the world, and we are still doing it today. That's a very dangerous concept. As Celia has mentioned, we know Haiti as an example, we have Palestine, we have Sudan, we have several examples, Afghanistan. We've seen what the perpetuation of colonial knowledge, quote unquote, has done to our countries. So I think the idea that countries still decide and pick and choose who they want to support, who they think deserves charity or assistance or help, is also a very important point that we need to acknowledge. And it is creating a very dangerous situation in how the West responds to a number of disasters and crises around the world.
Do you want me to go, Megan? Yeah, I mean, this is what Celia and Tamriz are saying right now is just so crucial. And they really complete each other. And I think I'm going to go in the media aspect. And at first, the two sides of the question you asked about knowledge and then about what's happening in the genocide happening in Gaza and all. And I think these two aspects are, at first I thought they were disjointed, but actually whose bodies and people, humanity we validate is linked to who we validate as epistemic beings. So who is able to talk about their situation in the media, for example, or is going to influence how we talk about it, and then who gets value, the deaths of who is recognized and criticized. And I think you talked about a few issues, Tamriz, but the difference between the media treatment of Gaza and Ukraine has been so, for me, so obvious, the difference in how we talk about migrants and people flying war and people flying, trying to escape a genocide, how we talk about those people. Like we were talking about the people escaping Ukraine because of the invasion, as people from media journalists would talk about them as people of similar to our civilization. Media in the West were trying to saying we should welcome them because they're like us. And then, and you made me think, Tamaris, about something I saw the other day about, oh, I wonder, it was a tweet, someone tweeted, people used to say, to think, how could they let everything during the Second World War happen? And then they must have not known everything. And now we realize, actually, we know. Actually, we know what's happening in Gaza, and we still do nothing. So there's a link between what we think and who we rescue. Puis peut-être une de ces discrepancies, une de ces différences que j'ai trouvé marquante, c'est le journal télévisé français de 13 heures l'autre jour qui a consacré 1 minute 45 secondes pour parler de, puis on sait qu'à la télé, là, tout est très court, pour parler du bombardement du Hezbollah sur une base militaire israélienne qui a fait 4 morts, 4 soldats israéliens. Bon, là, dans le reportage, on a rappelé que ils avaient 19 ans, que le trauma était très grand pour les militaires de la base, que l'armée israélienne devait répliquer. Donc, on a vraiment enrobé tout ça assez longuement. Ouais, là, j'ai switché de langage, donc on me demande de... Sorry, I'm gonna keep going in English, so it's clear.
Maïta, we have a live interpretation in French and English, so feel free to speak in the language you want. No worries.
Yeah, well, I'll keep going in English. It doesn't matter. So yeah, so then 1 minute and 45 seconds on that attack, 4 deaths, military deaths, and then 11 seconds to talk about how Israel bombarded a hospital, burning alive civilians. 11 seconds. And you see that and you think, oh yeah, the two sides of the medals. Are we really talking the same way about the two sides of the medals? No, we're not. And personally, every time I had to answer questions in the media about Gaza, every time you have to defend yourself and say, oh, but I'm not like pro Hamas. And yeah, it's very, it's horrible what they did to, you know, on October 7. And you always have to defend, but in other cases, it's not. It's as if in that case, there's not like a good guy and a bad guy. It's everyone should be criticized all the time, but that's an epistemic choice we do. That's the lives of who we validate, and that's it. That's important when we think about knowledge, about discourse, how we talk about people, the humanity of whom we recognize. And so we think, and it's true that compared to other things happening in the world, we talk more about Gaza, but we still don't talk about it the way we would talk about it if these were white people. So that, I mean, it's the question of international development then flows from that, where it's just that when we think about this specific issue, it's so obvious that it's a case study of coloniality of power, the bodies of who we value, and then the knowledge of who we value. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you all for your great perspective on the topic. And before we change question, I would like to hear your thoughts, Berta, on today's effects when it comes to who generates knowledge and from where. Just making sure, Berta, if you could hear me.
Yes, I could hear you. Which question is that?
It's linked to the second question again, just going back to who generates knowledge and from where, and the effects on today's either situation that are happening or more broadly, the way you want to go with the question.
Oh, thanks so much. When you look at the second question, the term colonial, yeah, it really makes me feel bad at some point because most countries are still being colonized. Yeah, so colonization is an approach to regulate territory or nations, just to create a different form of denominations by the certain group of people. So this aim is to empower the state just to aid a global domination. So being in a country today, in our country, we're celebrating independence, which we got in 1964. I still at some point, and also other countries like Gaza, what is going on, Haiti, Congo, we are still under colonial because we are not yet independent. Most of our institutions, sectors are still under control. Let's take, for example, educations. We are not allowed to speak our own language. Yeah, we are forced to speak the foreign language most of the time in our education sector. So it is important to ensure that if the colonial has to be eradicated, we need to promote decolonizations because we still feel that we are still under control. And this has been a great challenge. And why should some countries, neighboring countries, come involved, support each other country when they are going through like what is going on in Gaza now? Why other countries rise up to support each other to make this come to an end? Because the knowledge that we are spreading, the knowledge that we are not recognizing, this will end to have billions of countries end up in poverty and lack of access to so many things, loss of resources, loss of education, that may lead to high poverty in countries that are being colonized, that are still facing a lot of wars every time and then. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for adding that. And so we'll move to the next question for the moment. And at any point, if we want to go back to some point of discussion, feel free to do so. So now in your own work, how have current practices around knowledge acquisition and validation affected the direction you could take or the approaches you employ? So your view of what's possible in the sector, and as a community leader and with your knowledge in climate justice, and I know you mentioned that question when introducing yourself, Farada, so I'd like to start by asking it to you.
So much, Megan. These are some really great questions. They do take a bit of time to like fully sit with and figure out. But one of the things is what I really like this panel is everyone mentioned like some pretty amazing things. Like Bertha mentioned that the educational system is done entirely in English or the colonizer's language. But when we look at knowledge, most of it is coming from a colonial lens from childhood. Because when you speak our original languages, indigenous languages like the Nahio, there's ideas and there's themes and knowledges that you can't get in English. When you try to translate Cree words into English, it just doesn't kind of work. So when you grow up speaking Cree, you already have a new paradigm that's that the colonial government's attempting to erase. And one of the things that I found interesting here is like, how does colonial roots of the international development sector influence whose knowledge is validated and valued? One of the main things that kind of speaks out to me is just like who brings attention to these issues. Sometimes we need the prime minister or even the president of the United States to admit an issue is a problem before society decides to do something about it. My people have been mentioning missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for a long time, or even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that residential schools had all these problematic issues. But for the longest time, Canadian media wasn't getting with the picture. They needed the prime minister at the time, Stephen Harper, before people decided change needed to happen, which is pretty amazing to me because, I don't know, just coming to that epiphany is interesting. So to answer the third question, I'll come back around to that. In your own work, how have current practices around knowledge acquisition and validation affected the directions you take or the approaches you employed? Your views of what is possible in the sector. Well, I grew up Indigenous. My grandfather always said anything is possible. And it's really important, and it may not sound important, to use powerhouse words, like words that empower others, focusing on empowering, and don't create a need to be needed. Because I notice in international development work, we're always trying to save other people, or always trying to give them something that they need from us, when it shouldn't be taken by that taken like that, if you ask me, because if we're gone, they're still going to need that. And they're not going to be able to be self-sustaining and self-sovereign. There's always that colonial mindset that we can use the land better than they can. And it still kind of applies if you ask me. Like, for example, just one moment, bear with me. Like in Zambia, we were taught the river code from Elder Chris, and he was a pretty amazing man. And it was an exercise that shows communities in a simplified manner on why it's important not to carry someone over the river, but to do it with them. That way, when you're gone, they can do it by themselves. I can't exactly show what the river code is right now through this online format, but it was a cool bit of knowledge that was shared, and it stuck with me for a while. And it's cool to hear about these ideas from the people themselves. There's already amazing leaders in each and every community. We just need to connect and listen to them. And I like what Tamri said. She was on a panel of all white people and there wasn't an African there. That is a sign of disconnection. We need to change that and flip that right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Farada, and for bringing in so much interesting experience that you have, and for accepting to share them with us. And now Mike, and you're going more into like it will be really a drastic shift from what we just heard, to go to a really scholar thing. But in your article, Decolonizing International Relations and Development Studies, what's in a buzzword? I just think it might be interesting to go back a bit to what you were arguing about, how to avoid depoliticizing the expression decolonizing by using it as a buzzword, and also going back to what you were saying a bit earlier, and to relate to that question, how it even translates to the discipline of international relation, because I know it's also something that you worked a lot with. So
yeah, thank you. We've seen well, it's true that it feels, what you said, Farada, was so passionate, and I'll come back to that later because there's so many things to unpack. But yeah, so we wrote that article because there's such a buzzwordization of the word decolonial. Now, I'm sure everyone on this panel has been asked multiple times to participate in a panel on decolonizing this or that, or the university and knowledge and yoga and food and whatever. And now I refuse to do so, and it's not that I refuse to participate. I refuse to participate in panels called decolonizing. So here we're talking about the colonial lens, which is crucial, but we're not decolonizing. If in global affairs and IDRC and many organizations in Canada ask me to participate in organized workshops to be better, to do things better, but what I tell them is, if you're in Canada and you want to decolonize and you don't give the land back, we're not decolonizing anything. And it's fine. You can do other things. You can do EDI. You can be more sensitive. You can be more anti-racist. So in the article, we say first decolonizing is about giving the land back. Then it's about, yes, it is also about intellectual decolonization. It is about validating all kinds of knowledge, all kinds of languages that have been that have gone through epistemicides, and we've prevented people from speaking their own languages. But it's also about coloniality of power. So you need to talk about racial capitalism. If you talk about decolonizing something and you only think about being less colonial in our language, in the way we speak, and the words we use in development, and hiring more BIPOC people, and you don't talk about how the system is organized around not only enables exploitation of Black and brown people, but encourages it, how capitalism is built under slavery and colonial past. If you don't talk about that in our field, even we're not doing the right work. So this, and also I think lastly, it's also about rehumanizing our relationships. So it's not just about deconstructing everything. It's also about rebuilding a world where everyone would have the same epistemic and weight and the same value. And it's still not the case. And in international development, I can speak from my experience, my work experience. We're about 15 professors now, and we have Celia only half the time, which is a great sadness to me, because she's co-appointed with the Feminist Institute. But out of 15 professors, and I work in a school of international development. and global studies. Out of 15 people, I think there's only 3 non-white people. And I consider myself as a Western people, like I'm a mixed race, white passing. And when I was hired, they hired 2 people at the same time. It was a broad position on international development. And they're always talking about how they need to be more diverse and this and that. And then they hired me and a white women professor, which tells you again how we value some types of knowledge coming from some places. And I've been trained in the West, in Canada, and that's why I speak the right language, I guess, and I use the right buzzwords. And then the third person, the women who arrived third in the competition was a non-white person, but and the other white women were hired. So it's not saying, oh, white people can never work in or on other countries or other people. It means that in our field right now, we assume that white people are better and more intelligent to work on other people in other countries. We would never hire in Canada a Canadianist who would be from Ghana, Black person from Ghana. We would never do that. But we hire constantly white people working or specializing on other regions of the world. So yeah, anyways, I'll leave it there.
Could I jump in? Just to take on from both Farada and Micah. Again, some personal experiences. So when I first came to Canada, I was in the 1990s as an international student in Toronto from Pakistan, and knowing virtually nothing about Canada's history. And I wanted to take that opportunity to learn. And that's when I was first exposed and made aware of Canada's Indigenous history. But it was a very, very sanitized version of it. And as a young student in my teen years, you didn't really understand a lot of, what the country had gone through. And then when I returned to Canada as an immigrant, 25 years later, that exposure was very different in the sense that you realize that the Indigenous history of Canada was just non-existent. Because by then you had at least, through current affairs and all and reading and work, picked up some of the undercurrents. But arriving here as an immigrant, even looking at myself as part of the immigrant community, I realized most of us had no clue of Canada's Indigenous past and its present, or the lack of a future. And many immigrant communities weren't even interested in it. They came to Canada, they had no idea. And I think that is a very important indication of how knowledge is suppressed colonially, even within countries with a colonial past, right? So that's the first thing, that you're suppressing knowledge even within your country amongst your own people. Forget about passing it down through a very Western lens to other countries. Secondly, this whole idea, and I've always said, to much chagrin of the sector, is that the sector itself is a misnomer. I mean, what is international development? What is development studies? Like Micah said, if we're only looking at development studies as how we make other countries better, that's not international development at all. That is basically either a political or a very, loosely altruistic motive that you have. Because development should be both sides. Your country has to develop as much as any other country does, and vice versa. But we're looking at international development as a sector that only exists in the global north. You will not see that as a sector in the global south unless it is associated with an organization of the global north. And the work that we do, for instance, in Pakistan, amongst ourselves, the economic, the social, the humanitarian work that we Pakistanis or any other countries like mine do is not recognized as development work, right? So that is one of the big misnomers. I mean, I don't think there's anything such as international development, and then that carries on to development studies, like Micah said. I mean, what is development studies then? Is it only white people teaching other white people about other non-white countries? And what is worse is non-white people coming and learning, doing development studies programming in white countries. I mean, seriously, I did that. My undergraduate degree was from York University in Toronto in environmental studies, which had a global development theme to it. And in those days, I was very young and, it was all very new to me. Now that I look back on it, I mean, we were studying all white people. who had been to non-white countries and were basically documenting their experiences and saying that is what international development is. Whereas that's not the case anymore, because you don't see a development studies program in a Global South university. We just don't have them because we don't need them. So I'll end there in terms of using this whole idea of development itself being a misnomer.
I can jump in. Yeah, in my own work, how have current practices around the knowledge? How I can go with this question is that when I look at the idea work that has been doing for so many years, promoting the young people, who are indigenous, the Canadian sector, it has really a good move. Because at some point when I was reading the history of Truth and Reconciliation document of the history of the indigenous young people and the trauma generation, which has been going on for so many years, the idea has been a very good example. The idea has been promoting more young people from different communities to expose them to international learning, like taking them to different developing countries, Zambia and other countries, which has been so good to make sure that there are also other countries that has been going through colonialism. And this has been influenced more young people to develop more leadership and back to their country to have more leaders who are able to also influence other young peoples to do different things in their communities. So besides that, the higher also influence on the technology has also affected the way we approach the education today. Find that most of the people nowadays, we no longer want to find solutions to the situations or challenges that are affecting us. Most of the time, we rely on internet, doing that, we forgetting about our culture. So the culture that we have brought up with is the best education that can transform our nations, that can also end colonialism. Because most of the time, we learn or we copy things that does not suit us. We just copy what we saw at the social media. So that also affects the education knowledge. Knowledge is so affected because most of the things that we do, we are just copying them. We're not doing that what we know or what we learn in our generation or from our parents. Sorry, I don't know if you are able to hear me. I'm closing. Sorry, I don't know if I was freezing.
We can
No,
hear
we
you.
could hear you.
Can
Thank
you
you so
hear
much.
us too?
Thank you so much. So that's what I was trying to say, that we are living out our tradition, our culture that we have grown up with. We are trying every time to copy up things that we see on the social media that also divert the knowledge how it should be delivered in our sectors. Thank you.
Thanks to you. And I think it's a great way to close that question. So thank you so much. I, of course, still want to give the opportunity if other people still want to add anything to that question before we move on.
Well, I will be able to merge responses.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
I said we can definitely move on to the next question, and if anything, I'll merge my responses. It'll be fine.
Perfect. Good. Yes, of course, also by doing your research, you did a big one, your thesis, I think, if I can call it that way. I'm not sure the exact words, but you may have like different approaches that you took to undertake that research, remembering the Duvalier state, gender, state repression, migration patterns between Haiti and Canada. And so if you want to share on that, or just want to give the space to everyone to speak, but
Sure, sure. Sure. Okay. I was really like kind of listening to my colleagues here because a lot of interesting things were being said. Um, so as for the research, yes, I did my doctoral research. And okay, so I guess I like also answer that question to a certain extent. I feel like when we're talking about the current manifestations of settler colonialism or racial violence and so on and so forth, that at some point when we're looking at practices, like I said, we need to question like what kind of impact they have. So when it gets to my own work, I guess that like my work was initially outside of the academia. And so when I had to leave Haiti and come here for multiple reasons, doing a dissertation was a means to an end, and kind of like was a means to keep working on things that were important to me, including the memory of political violence in Haiti and how it was lived and remembered also in Montreal. So I guess some principles in terms of like how that research was done was that it was a kind of an insider type of research that I was like interviewing people from my community, relatives, friends, so on and so forth. So that comes with privilege in terms of access and a lot of pressure in terms of what you write and what it does for or to your community and what they want to see happen. But I think it's actually, in terms of ethics, one of the best ways, because it is like doing research and work within your community that like keeps you accountable, right? And like find ways to produce research that actually centers their voices and not necessarily yours as an author or scholar or whatever, however it is that you define yourself. So that was like kind of like the what brought the richness of the dissertation that is like slowly becoming a book. I'll keep you posted. But I think that like those same principles to me like guide my current practices, because I feel like when we're dealing with war, or you've called it crisis or genocide, at some points we need to also figure out what it is that we want to do, what's important. So is it producing knowledge, publishing articles, I don't know, media articles, or actually maybe thinking about preserving knowledge where it's disappearing, and also protecting the knowledge producers when their lives are in danger. So my current practices have been different recently, because it has been more about like supporting some of my colleagues, and also figuring out how we can actually preserve some archives, and also feminist genealogies coming from those geographies, more so than, I guess, trying to comply with the publish or perish that the university imposes on us. So that's that.
Thank you so much for adding on that. And also I can speak for everyone, I think, by saying that we can wait to see if it's going to be a book or not, and if so, to get it. So keep us informed on that end. And now going back a bit more on the redefining knowledge part, more concretely, I'd like to hear about can the transformation we are discussing be nurtured within a sector that remains financially tied to historically colonial institutions? And so how can we navigate this inherent contradiction? And I would first direct the question to you, Tamaris.
Short answer, no. I don't think we can achieve everything that we're discussing, given the way the sector currently is, and unfortunately, the way I think it will remain for a long time. Because what we're talking about, at least, us in this close space, is far more radical than what I think the sector expects. And anything that's radical does not go down well with a system that has been in control and in power for such a long time. So no, I don't think transformation is possible in this sector the way we would like it to be, until we actually all agree that the sector is broken. and fixing it isn't going to help either. So I don't know really. I mean, this is one of the conundrums after I left the sector was what do we do then, right? We don't want to see aid or international development in the form that it has been all this time. Keeping it there, but changing it, which is what INGOs and donors and, the academia, et cetera, are all, talking about, will not actually happen unless you remove yourself from the picture. And obviously, nobody wants to remove themselves from the picture and invite others perhaps in. So then what do we do? So the biggest thing for me was activism. And that's also something that I look at in terms of knowledge generation. So I wrote a chapter last year in a book where I coined the term pracademicism. And pracademics, we know what that is. It's an amalgamation of, academia and practitioner-based knowledge, which is becoming quite popular in development in particular. But I added a third element to it. I added the element of activism to it because activism is exactly what we need. And activism can be defined in many ways. It can be defined in what, many of us are doing for Palestine. It can be defined in our resisting the current system. It can be defined in our getting out on the streets, etc. So there's this whole gamut of how we define activism. But the knowledge that we get from activism is something that we don't even actually get it from practitioner experience. We get it from the very raw emotional context of people and how their lives are being impacted by something. And that's not even the development of the community perspective. That's just literally raw emotion. And we cannot ignore that raw emotion anymore. I mean, people see it and they want to ignore it as something that's very, childish or very subjective. But I think bringing activism into the mix is something that will really, I think it'll jostle people to wake up. Because right now we see activism as a very out there sort of a thing. Like I remember when I was reading somewhere or I can't remember, but it was academics saying, well, academics cannot be activists. That's not us. And you're like, everybody can be an activist, actually. It doesn't matter who you are, it's what you feel inside you and what you believe in. So I think, no, we cannot transform the system and we cannot include the ways of working that we would like to see until I think the system really dies down. And I don't see that happening in the near future, unfortunately, but I think we can continue to work towards that, at least through just being honest about what we see and insisting that we are all heard everywhere.
So much, Tamris. Incredible words. I'll go after her. But personally, I do believe that the transformation we are discussing is possible. Anything is possible. But we need to come to terms with the truth. And the truth of the matter is that Canada is involved in a lot of resource exploitation in other countries like Zambia, where they have their copper belt. And it's interesting that I was given an internship to visit Zambia. Now I'm aware of some of these issues. And I like to periodically check back, see what's going on. But I was the average Canadian before that trip. I didn't even know where Zambia was on the map, nor was I really aware of the issues that they're facing. So I believe that connection itself is one of the keys in transforming the sector and changing the word from development to empowerment. And it's going to take radical changes, like Tamris has said, like entirely radical changes where you lift the system up and you replace it entirely. Because development is seen, at least politically, is that it's a necessary thing for Canada to thrive as a country. We're always talking about how Canada's a leader in gender equality and all kinds of things, but when you really look at what's going on, we're not actually. And it'd be really great to start coming to terms with the truth. My mentor mentioned that a while back, and it was really incredible words. Because we do say that Canada is these big good guys changing the world, but we need to change the narrative and just admit, no, we aren't that good in these fields. We're still developing as a nation ourselves, and we don't really have the right to say that we're the best or we're a leader in everything, and that we need international development to stay on top when we're doing more harm to these countries than good. If you really look at the copper belt, you should really look into the copper belt. Because I've seen a politician come up and say we needed to do this, is so necessary. But the thing is, he doesn't live in these communities that are getting exploited. He would change his tune entirely if he had to live there his entire life. And that's the truth. It might be a little harsh, but that is it. And that's all I have to say.
I'll jump in because I'm so happy you answered in such a brilliant way, because Temriz and I have had this debate for years now, and every time I hear her speak, I'm more and more leaning towards, well, no, we can't change it. There's no way we can change the sector. But I agree with you, Ferrada, actually, that we need to try. We have to, and the first step, as you say, is recognizing. And I'll go even further. We need to recognize that Canada is involved, our country is involved in perpetuating exploitation and allowing its companies and allowing its international agents to perpetuate inequalities and payage and exploitation, but also our organizations that we need, and that's difficult. And every time we talk about that, every time I participate in workshops and conferences, people are like, "Oh yeah, you're right, you're so right. That Canada is such a has done so many bad things in the world," and then they don't realize, yeah, but we need to. It's an inward looking about what our organizations, maybe the projects we did last year, maybe the project we're doing now, we are involved in that power structure, and we, through our work, are encouraging this world order where we are privileged and we exploit other people. It's very hard, and I think the first step is recognizing it, acknowledging systemic racism and the legacies of colonialism, which, I mean, maybe around this table we do, but collectively we don't. And we talk about so many other things. We put so much weight on other issues, but not on the perpetuation of those racial hierarchies under the capitalist system and in our sector. Not only, with people in our organization, like who we hire and how we treat them, but with the work we do. So good intentions are not good enough anymore. And we need to realize that they were never good enough to start with, but we did things and we did things badly. And now we need to disrupt the system. It's true. How? I'm not sure how, because, small steps are always easy, but it's not enough. So I'll keep thinking about how we could do that. But we need to try to do better, because I'm pretty sure around the table, people are all paid by organizations in that sector. And I'm pretty sure you don't want to lose your job. As Temriz said, I think we would be in a better world if those actions were not made by us, but were made by other people and also organized differently and also very different. But we are in that system. So so we need to think about that collectively.
I can jump in. For sure, I believe it's possible and somehow very difficult. Why I'm saying so is that most of the countries, they rely financially on other people. In this case, it has really been so difficult, unless if most of the education system be revised to ensure that people opens up mind in the different ways. You find that people, especially in developing countries, they may be seated on diamond and they don't know how to extract that diamond so that they become independent. They'll still need someone out to come and help them to get the diamond, which is just near them. So this it will be really very difficult, because knowledge of knowing how to extract the wealth which is just next to you is still very, very, very far. So I can suggest that it's so difficult. It can be possible, but it really need more effort of having some curriculum revised, teaching the communities to know the ways on how they can navigate the resources which they have in their community or in their country. This is things that has been inherited for so many years, and it has been so difficult, like for a state or a country to become so independent financially. Most of the time, their education, their everything that is in their state is still being controlled out there. So that's what I heard in this one. That's what I wanted to comment. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for your great perspective on both sides. I think it's really important to reflect on that, and I feel like it's something that we all had to do at some point, and it's a continued reflection we have to do. And so thank you so much for bringing that on the table. And so moving on to the last question that will conclude our incredible discussion today. Having looked at the current landscape and coloniality, of current practices around knowledge and research in our sector, some of the challenges and impacts, I think it would be interesting to conclude by hearing your perspective on what you think exists beyond the colonial lens for your work, for the sector, and for the communities we serve. So what keeps you moving toward that vision? And again, for this one, I'll really just let you all be in discussion. Celia, I see your hand, so you can go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously I'm always like happy to disrupt. So no, it was actually a suggestion, like which would be like, is it possible for us to kind of like let the question percolate in our mind while perhaps we open it up to the Q&A, because I'm just like looking at the time, and it would really be a shame if we didn't get to hear from all the 50-ish people who are here, and maybe have a chance to have a conversation.
Of course, always love to change the plan. Plans are made to be changed. And so I think it's a great idea, great opportunity. And yes, we always like to offer space to everyone, as everyone has great expertise and insight to the topic that we speak. And so we can open up the floor right now to see if people have questions, what they would like to discuss with the speakers. And so I'm just going to remove the spotlight, if you don't mind, so that it feels a bit more like inclusive and that we're all together. So as I do so, I invite people to just raise your hand to take the mic, or you can always also ask questions in the chat if you feel more comfortable.
First question is always the most painful one.
Trying to read the chat as well. I don't have my glasses, so I'm sorry. Bear with me. It takes a moment. It's so small, but also going to wait.
Hello.
Have a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Chris. Yeah, I am so glad to be here, and I listened to the whole presentation. It was great, and although I'm joining from Nigeria, first of all, yeah, and is there a new form of is there a new form of development in a way that it has shifted from what it was before? Like I know development could be defined as maybe, the, support for, like marginalized countries and global south for economic growth. That's my not like as if that's the real definition, but that's what I'm just thinking, that it has to do with, assistant aid and to support. And the concept behind it could be to develop this country so there will be less unplanned, maybe migration, and just like when you're looking at concept of like, city migration. So is there a new form of development that has changed from that concept and that note of, or those ideas of, aid and support? Is there a new form of development that is more broad-based or something? Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Celia.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for your question. I guess like I don't know that like we I mean they're like we always have like genealogies of development like frameworks, right? Um when it gets to the conversation that we're having now, I'm thinking, and I've been thinking for a long time, that there might be more potential in actually looking at the ways in which different movements, social movements, have been historically organizing. In the sense that, like, if we again move away from our developmentalist like framework and like look at the lessons learned from transnational and internationalist movements that were kind of like organizing more so on a basis of solidarity, we see that there are different ways to interact across borders. These movements also have like to deal with issues of like coloniality and racism and so on and so forth. But like we are definitely looking at different political projects, and even if it's just um, 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 initially perhaps a theoretical objective that they haven't always like achieved, the basis for the collaboration is like collaborating between equals, right? So I think that there are things to be learned from all kinds of like traditions, like Black radical traditions, Pan-Africanism, all kinds of like internationalist platforms. We also see that kind of like organizing across borders for indigenous like sovereignty and issues. So this is what like I'm more interested in at the moment.
If I may jump in, that's a great question to end this panel. I think we need to be hopeful. And I'll say first, we should not think about it as development. And as Temre said, I think the word is so colonial. And if we think about initiatives of development, that I'm not going to tell you about an NGO from Canada doing something in Ghana. That's not inspiring to me. What's inspiring to me is international solidarity. And look at the work of No White Saviors in Uganda, in the Sankara Library. Look at the women workers in Bangladesh fighting for union, the organization of unions, the blocking of railways by indigenous activists here, struggles against La Loi 21, against the interdiction of wearing the veil in public office, Solidarité Sans Frontières, Bandung du Nord, Roads Must Fall. There's movements of international solidarity within Canada and in many other countries. And in all those, it's how we can support and visibilize the fights of many people around the world. So I think we need to be in support and not think about how we can do our projects better.
I don't know if another speaker wanted to answer that question. If so, please do so. Otherwise, I'll move to the next one.
Okay, I want to try. I think how to bring development starts from individual, community, national, and body. Yeah, because what we need to know is that development has to start with us, and as individuals, we can bring development. And also, if we become so independent, peace, than promoting conflict. Conflict always was to have more development, because the things that you damage may need to be recovered. So if we promote peace, starting from our own countries, yeah, that could be the best way of bringing the development. Yeah. So that would contribute.
Thank you so much, Berta. I see, Ferhada, you have your hand raised. Is it to answer that question?
Yes, I would love to answer the question, but I also seen Temri's unmute her mic first, so I'd like to pass it on to her.
No, that's fine, Parada. I wanted to respond to a couple of the questions in the chat, which I think we can get to later. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I've been reading some of these questions in the chat, and they're really, really interesting questions. I'd just like to thank everyone again. But I do believe that development work, and I'm hoping for empowerment because it does really work. FIDEA has been working with Indigenous communities across Canada and in Zambia, Uganda, and Tanzania And I wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for the investment from Videa, who they built me up as a leader, honed my skills, and given me opportunities to speak on panels like this. If you ask me, work like that is really, really important because we are allowed to share from two different paradigms, the Western one and the indigenous paradigms, and even in Africa, so more than two, really. And it's really amazing to see because there's certain bits of knowledge that I believe that every single human being is allowed to offer. Like, for example, I really like this question that Hillary posed. What is decolonization? Uh, I'll just abridge it because I can't go to it right now. It's like really high up. But anywho, decolonization is being able to say that you're proud of who you are and to introduce yourself in your language and know where you come from. My grandfather always said, introduce yourself in your language. And I do believe it's really powerful, especially as a Nehio and Ayat Gabi, to say, I am proud of who I am. I am proud of my people. They're beautiful, amazing people with a beautiful, amazing culture. And the reason why it's so powerful, because if you look at it from a context, Canadian society tried to teach me that my people were primitive, our ways didn't work, or that we need to get on with the modern age. But these human elements, this self-love, these teachings about balancing yourself are more important now than ever. I'm able to say these words because I've done the work to overcome, some of the things that I've dealt with in my childhood, like CFS, being connected, all kinds of abuses. But the culture, my culture specifically, has helped me to regain that sense of self and know who I am and to say, all these wonderful, beautiful, positive things. And I can see that they are important. And I would love for everyone to say that they're proud of who they are, no matter where they come from, in all areas. Like, that would just be really cool to see. And I think that'll be it for me. I love you all and have the best day ever.
Thank you so much, Farada. I feel like your intervention are always so much full of care and full of honesty. And thank you for your vulnerability. I cannot say that word in English, so it sounds a bit weird, but thank you so much. Just really appreciate. And to jump on some of the question in the chat, I think that's what you wanted to do, Temery. So I don't know if there's a lot, so I can either read some, or I guess since you opened your mic before, maybe you had a specific question in mind you wanted to answer. So I'll let you do it.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I'm just looking at a number. There's a thread of questions and comments that are very similar. They're following off, and that's this concern about, for those of you who are in this sector, what is your positionality? Should you leave the sector? Should you stay in it and try and change it? That's what I wanted to address, because I know that's not an easy, it's just not an easy thing to do. I get asked a lot by students in development studies or those who want to join the sector about, what advice would you give us if we wanted to join the sector? And I always say, don't join it, right? Because what we're trying to do here is decrease the influence of this sector as a global project, or a Western project. We're trying to decrease that. And by you joining it, you're only in a way perpetuating that, the sector. And its importance, or its vibrancy, or the pay that you get, or the fact that you get to travel the world for free, and you're an expat and all that stuff. It's not to discourage you not to do better or not to do better for others. But it's basically, for me, this sector is not the way to do it. And I saw a comment that says, okay, if we leave it, then we're still opening up spaces for those who might just continue to perpetuate it. And I understand that's a risk as well. I took a risk, and I granted that I took a risk after being in the sector for 25 years, right? I mean, I was done by then, but I did spend a good 25 years working in the sector before I decided to leave it. The risk that I have taken as an individual is that I have narrowed my focus, that people don't approach me at all, even to a large extent, to work with, because my stance is very radical. I've lost a lot of financial stability and compensation. I have lost contacts. I've received a lot of hate for what I say. But at the end of the day, you have to realize that if you've chosen a path of resistance and you want to do something different, that means you have to take the risks of that as well, whatever they may be. Again, that's up to an individual. I'm not here to sort of, tell you, no, you better leave right now, leave the sector, leave your job. No, that's not it. But if you really want a radical change, I've realized it's very difficult to do it from the inside. Although that's been the norm. And you have to step out and do it. And you have to then take the risks associated with that. And that, I think, just ties into another question that came up about decolonization, right? So what are the examples of that? I think what I've done is that even though I, like Micah, I do not agree with the term decolonization. In fact, that's a reason why so many people don't like me, because I keep critiquing them on that. But let's use it for the sake of using it. I have decolonized myself because I don't work with donors anymore. I don't take money from them. I don't work on, conventional international development projects anymore. I just don't do that. And that's the risk I've taken. But I think the idea that what many people don't realize is that in our countries, majority of people are working on their own. They're not working with international development programming. They're not working on projects. They're working on their own, in their own communities, in their own groups, with their own organizations. That is decolonization in action. It's not getting donors and INGOs to decolonize, whatever that means. That is real decolonizations, when countries and communities within those countries work on their own. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamaris. So like you said, I guess that answered a lot of similar questions that were in the chat. And Gina, I see your hand. So for the sake of time, I think this will be the last question. I'm so sorry. We'll see how it goes, but yeah, just prepare yourself. So Gina, you can go ahead.
Sorry, I thought I put it down, but I'll ask it quickly. Thank you so much to all the speakers and everyone who's here. I was thinking at the Cooperation Canada Futures Forum 2 weeks ago. Time is a blur. It's a lie. I was shocked and disheartened, but then after I processed it, not really that surprised, because a couple of years ago, that conference, like the conversations happening at the conference, it's not a dig at our lovely Cooperation Canada colleagues, were, I think, quite different. And what I wanted to feel was hope that the sector could improve, or sectors, whatever the heck those are. And this time around, it seemed to be a reminder of what I think the term that you use in the Micah and Timbrys and the White Saviorism in International Development book. I think it's White Saviorism Industrial Complex. Am I lying? Correct me. Okay. I was really reminded of that at the conference. And it came out so much more strongly in the conversations than I've seen in quite a while. And it felt like such a regression in the sector. But maybe it was more just a continuation, and it kind of reminded me of how big that architecture is and what a vested interest so many very powerful actors with a lot of money have in maintaining the status quo of how these systems function and how we circulate power in the sector. I'm obviously part of it. And so I'm curious if any of you have any reflections that you want to share on that, just how, like, this idea of the sector disappearing seems completely unrealistic. And even those of us who sort of have fantasies of working from within it to change it, have those moments of kind of, oh boy, like, really? Yeah, so I'm curious if any of you have any reactions to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your question, Gina. So personally, I do believe that changes are coming, and I've kind of lived it. Like, there wasn't really an opportunity to do much. Before I signed on with Videa, I was going to work at a gas station or the casino as a front desk agent again. But Videa has really made like such an important impact on my life and other people's lives, where they are given the opportunity to succeed and grow and change. And I'll speak on some of the panels there over at the conference. And I guess we might not have attended the same panels, but I did see like more examples of diversity, examples of, different perspectives being focused and, brought in. I think it's a pretty interesting change because my ancestors, or not even the last generation, didn't exactly have a seat at the table. It just didn't happen. 60 years ago, we had the pass system in Canada where if you wanted to leave the reserve, you needed to get a permission from the Indian agent. Things are changing fast. We're seeing more Indigenous people within these sectors sharing bits and pieces of knowledge that does make a huge difference. One of them that I really like is just some of our prophecies about putting the woman forward ahead of the man, because women are more community oriented. And I've gotten so many cool teachings in Zambia where they say, if you're doing community work, focus on the women first, because they're the ones who are aware of the issues and what needs to be done. And in my way, it's, put the women forward. Because the men, we've been running this show for how long, and we're not exactly doing a good job. I think it's good to just be honest about that and specifically empower women community leaders. That's what I've been taught. I do believe good changes are coming. The more you acknowledge it, the more it happens. Thank you.
Well, I was gonna be pessimistic, and now you sound so hopeful that I'm not sure if I'm gonna be, because I spend a lot of time with Tabriz, and I feel on this one I'll be the pessimist, because I feel like we have these conversations in these spaces, and then we believe that there's a change. And I was in the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development on the board for a little while, and we had all these conversations. They asked me to organize a keynote panel, and I know I invited this Indian economist. It was great. And then the year before, I invited Felwin Sar, and we talked about decolonizing development, and it was big, interesting conversations, and everyone nods their head. And then they go back to their day lives, and they do nothing. That's why personally I feel like we can be transformative and we can change, and that's why I'm giving workshops to organizations in terms of like how to do better and how to come to terms with the colonial past of the field. And I'm doing it because people are going to stay in that field, and if they do, might as well do it better. But I feel like most of the people, and in development studies it's the same thing. It's like, oh, they love what I do, they love that I do research on the Western gaze and this and that and feminist stuff, but then it takes a long time. And I study teaching now. I study syllabus in international relations and in development, and we see that the change isn't as fast as we believe it is, or it's not as fast as we think. And I think our minds are somewhere else now, but our practices in terms of teaching at least is still very much colonial. But still, I'm hopeful.
Can I just mention really quickly? I really liked what you shared, Micah. Your perspective is incredible. It's really cool to sit down and share space with you. But I do want to say one thing. Everyone thinks it's impossible until it's done. Changes are coming.
Can you be president of the world? I'd love that.
Nah, too much spotlight.
Celia, you can jump in to also answer.
Okay, I'm not gonna answer. I'm just gonna share thoughts, really. Maybe just also like circling back to some questions that were in the chat, and someone asked a question about like how we feel about South-South cooperation. And I think to me that's one of the keys, or one of the things that I'm interested in. Like if thinking about like South and West as not as geographies, as political projects, right? I think that that's what I am focusing on. I have been focusing a little bit more on, because I'm not politically, I'm not super keen on recentering whiteness or working on white saviorism or whatnot. So to me, it's just it's not that like change is coming. It's that we have been resisting for a long time, and we keep resisting and we keep fighting. And just like Temris was saying, people have always worked outside of those like circles, and they will keep doing so. So it's more so how can we be strategic in alliances, so on and so forth, right? So for me, South-South cooperation doesn't have to be something that is mediated by the UN or an NGO. But you know, if you have people in NGOs or UN who are like willing to fund stuff that they stay out of, yeah, do it. You know, yeah. So for me, I guess that's what I'm just like kind of like in a mindset that like we do have genealogies of like of resistance in all of our communities, also transnational communities. So we might as well try to document that work, learn from it, and keep like kind of like somehow refining, recycling those strategies because we're going to need them and we keep needing them.
If I could just pick up from Celia's point about South-South cooperation, and I saw that question as well. South-South cooperation has also sort of recently become a very big buzzword. And everybody thinks that that's, because North-South isn't working, South-South might work, right? So that's not how the world works, really. We also never talk about geopolitics when we're talking about international development. And geopolitics is everywhere. It's not just between powerful Western nations and not so powerful non-Western nations. It's also between perhaps a powerful Southern nation and a not so powerful Southern nation. In fact, it's more between these sets of countries than it is the other way around, because we've just got, we've got 5 countries that know, well, a few more that in the north that we know are the culprits. But South-South cooperation is also becoming a very romanticized notion of a solution to how we work together. And I think we really need to caution that, and anything that the UN supports through initiatives of South-South, I think really need to be looked at very, very cautiously, because they are, again, co-opting that space, which is not theirs. And they're using it as a project to continue their own existence. South-South cooperation, if it has to happen entirely on its own. It has to happen on the terms of those countries individually, whether they're 2, 3, or 4 working together. South-South cooperation is very dependent on regional relationships, which we know many regions do not have good relations with each other, regardless of the common geography or history that they share. So I think this entire South-South idea also needs to be taken very cautiously when we talk about development, because we can't now talk about international development without international geopolitics, and that's what's governing most countries of the world these days.
But I thought we were in agreement that we were not using that development framework anymore. And yes, that the South and the West is a political project, not a geography. We are 100% aligned.
Well, thank you so much. And looking at the time, I now have to be that not nice person who brings us back to the schedule, which we could talk a lot also about coloniality and times and everything related to that. So it feels always weird when having these so important conversations to have to be that person. But yeah, first of all, thank you all for your great question, for being so engaging with the speaker, with the topic. Really appreciate. And I feel like there are so many takeaways from this discussion. And I think a big one being around the conversation on whether this transformation can be nurtured in the sector or not. We came back a lot to that topic, and I personally I find both perspective really refreshing and important. For some, it's about not taking part in the sector, and it's a question that is there and we'll have to think about and we'll mostly act on. But there's also the other perspective that is also really refreshing, and we've heard some suggestion about maybe changing development by empowerment and seeing things differently. And yeah, it's also really refreshing to hear that too. And so I think it's something we'll all be reflecting when leaving this space. But also we've heard that decolonization as a buzzword, but yeah, for the purpose of the conversation, cannot be performative or discourse to bring activism in the mix. There's a need for rehumanizing our relationship. Also the danger of buzzwords. There's, I think, overall a call for de-Westernization of knowledge and a need for a shift in the geography and biography of knowledges. We need to reflect on the coloniality of Western academia and how colonial language are being prioritized in that big mix too. And last but not least, what is even international development and international development studies? I'll leave on this great quote from Temriz. And so before going to the closing remark, there's some stuff as the Art Hub we wanted to share. But before that, I would like to offer the last words to our speaker. So if there's anything really quickly you wanted to go back to bounce off on, feel free to do so.
Just thank you for the organization, and everything that the hub is doing is incredible. A few years ago when we started that task force and Temriz was involved and a lot of people were involved, and I never thought that it would lead to you amazing people in charge of the anti-racist hub. So thank you.
Yeah, I can also say that in our mind, we have to think about colonizations, which belongs to all of us. So it asks us every time to have a good relationship to the indigenous lands that colonized have been in injustice. Okay, so we need to promote equitable and addressing inequalities through education, dialogue, communications, and calling for actions that to make sure that our countries will be at the good level. Thanks so much for all your attention and all the audience that have been with us here.
Just wanted to build on what Bertha said just really quickly. Thank you so much to the organizers for hosting this amazing panel. It could have easily have been, an easy layout where we got an all-white male panel, but no, we got so many diverse, amazing voices from incredible women. Like, celebrate yourselves. You are incredible. Even the organizers. Have a good celebration, pat yourself on the back, and treat yourself. You worked hard. Thank you.
And I'll just second, third, and fourth that and say that I have always been a devil's advocate. And just because I'm very pessimistic and negative doesn't mean that I don't have hope. So it's just that somebody needs to be a little pessimistic to sort of, prod everybody and say, no, things are not going well. No, things are not changing. But that's only because you want things to change and you want to be hopeful about the future for everyone. So thank you very much for the invitation and to be part of this great gathering.
I'm just gonna triple, quadruple down. Thank you so much. It was really a rich conversation. And thank you so much for creating this space so we can actually have these I don't know, difficult conversations. I don't know how do we call them these days, contested. But thanks a lot. And I hope we'll have many opportunities to continue our exchanges.
Well, thank you to you all. Thank you to the speakers for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to share your insightful perspective and doing so with such honesty and care towards each other, but also with the participant, with me, with the Art Hub. Really appreciate, and it's always a pleasure to engage with you all. And so I think each and every one of your contribution has been most valuable, and it has shown also the importance of the plurality of knowledge and the vast range of perspective and direction that are possible. And to go back to what you were saying, Temriz, I think, yes, we can be pessimistic, but also hopeful. Like, those can exist at the same time. And I think it's important that those exist at the same time, because it's always important to press pause, to reflect, to be pessimistic, but also to want something greater for the future. And so I hope we'll all contribute in our own way to shape that futures, and to reflect on who should be at the center of this. And I'll stop rambling here, but again, thank you so much. And also thank you to all participants for being here. And so we just have to take a quick moment to, we wanted, as the Art Hub, to touch base on some stuff that are happening And so I'm just trying to find where I'm at. Okay, the presentation is here, sorry. So yeah, we'd like to take the opportunity to invite you to check your website. There's some stuff happening real soon. We have a training on November 26th, which is equitable response and anti-racist lens on effectiveness in moments of crisis. We have our 2024 annual report that has just been published and is available on our website. And so that report is is possible because of the contribution of the task force, which has been created even before the ARC Hub. And so this continues, and it's a great way to take a moment to see where we are at, but also to see how some questions are being asked again, some recommendation. It's the same. We're just reiterating stuff because there's not a lot that is changing. And so great links to be made here too. We also have our newsletters, our bulletin. And so, yeah, inviting you all to look at that, to stay engaged with what we're doing. And on a weird note, but we have to do it. We are a GAC funded program, and so we have to report back and collect data. And so, but it's also a way for us to get your feedback, which we value a lot. It's important for us to sometimes take a moment and change things for future event. And so there's a link in the chat to access the post-event survey or the QR code that is no longer here, but in the chat, you should have the link to access the post-event survey. So yeah, that concludes our really interesting session. And again, want to thank you all for your participation and for the speaker for being here today.